Welcome to the Contracting Officer Podcast. It's not just for contracting officers. If you're anywhere in the government acquisition world, this podcast is for you. We're introducing a concept today called the GovCon Acquisition Cube to help you tie together in your mind all the pieces and parts that go into a government acquisition that end up in a contract award. This episode is brought to you, as always, by Skyway Acquisition. Check out skywayacq.com. And without further ado, here we go with today's episode. We'll start this episode the way we've started probably 63.5% of our episodes. Government contracting is complicated. It's not an easy monster to break into. There's so many different rules, regulations, so many different ways to do it. It can be overwhelming.
I love when we're able to break it down to something simple or simpler. And one of those simpler concepts is the GovCon Cube. Getting a contract awarded takes 6 basic elements, hence the cube, right? 6 sides. I actually looked this up. A cube is the only convex polyhedron whose faces are all squares, meaning that they're all equally important. So that's why this GovCon Cube makes sense, because all 6 elements we're going to talk about are equally important.
I understand the equally important and square thing. The rest of that might be over my head. You'll recognize these elements. The common terms are the what, when, where, who, how, and not really why in this case. It's how much. It's the price side of it. We're not going to use the common terms. We're going to use the acquisition version of these terms to explain how these 6 elements fit on the sides and top and bottom to make a cube. Before we get to that, let's stop and say thanks.
Thanks this week goes to Michael Klein. He's from Sunnyvale, California. Michael is a sales intern at CrowdStrike, which is a software security company. I want to thank Michael for a podcast feedback call. He shared how he found our podcast, how he uses our podcast to better understand the government's buying processes. And we had a great conversation where I learned he's a student of GovCon sales, and he uses the podcast to help him with that. When folks like Michael take the time to set up a call and give me their feedback, we learn how to make our podcast even more useful to you. Thank you to Michael for helping us continue to make government contracting better, one contract at a time.
Thanks, Michael. All right, back to the GovCon Cube. The 6 parts, the 6 sides of a GovCon acquisition, a government contracting acquisition in cube form. First.
Cube form, it's like cuberdized.
Did you say Cubert?
I did.
That's old guy video game stuff. Look it up.
Video game, that's right.
The solution is the first. The solution is the what. What are we buying?
This is the product or service that solves the problem the government has. In GovCon, this is the industry's solution to solve that problem. That's hence the term solution.
Next is the schedule. This is the when.
When are we going to get it? And this drives the availability, the price, the actual delivery. Can it be delivered on schedule? We have to know what the schedule is.
All these things are intertwined. That leads us to the next, the location. This is the where. It's the place of performance or the delivery location. And again, this is all wrapped up with the other sides of the cube. They don't work well without each other. After location, we get to the provider. This is the who.
We can't award a contract without a contractor, right? You have to have that part. You have to know who is going to be delivering the product or service.
Next is the price. This is how much. And of course, it's driven by the government's budget, but they have to know how much budget to reserve for this particular thing that they need to buy. It's closely related to the schedule, the when, the location, the where do you need this, and can even be related to the who. And these all lead us to the final side of the cube, which is the acquisition strategy. This is the how. This is the how we're going to buy it. And all of the other sides of the cube connect to get you to the acquisition strategy.
The government team cares because this acquisition strategy, it allows them to get the mission done on time, on budget, and what the requirement meant, assuming they considered all the other sides of the cube. The industry side cares about the how, because this is how it gets awarded to them. How they become the who. They have to understand how the government is going to buy it. That's what the acquisition strategy tells them.
All right, we're talking about a somewhat complex topic to understand on a podcast. You have to visualize a cube, right? So we'll walk through these again and try to help visualize the cube.
The base of the cube is the solution. It's the what. And if you don't have a what, then there's really no purpose to do any of this. So what is it? Why do we need it? That's the base of the cube. Then you have the sides. So the first side is the schedule, the when. The second side is the location, the where. The third side is the provider, the who, what kind of organization could deliver this. The fourth side is the price. So when you have those five, you have the base is the solution, and then the when, where, who, and how much. And then the root of this cube is the acquisition plan. And you can think about how a cube is built, right? If any of those is not the same size, the cube's not going to be a cube anymore. It's some other, I don't know, geometry term. But if you look at a cube that's not all equal sides, it's going to be off kilter. And you visually get why it's important that all six of these elements have to be clearly understood by both sides.
Yeah. And now it doesn't work without any of them. Without a base, you have nothing to build on. Without any one of the sides, it collapses. And without a roof on top, when it rains, you basically have a bucket instead of a cube. We've talked about these elements throughout a couple hundred podcasts now in different ways. This cube concept is how we tie them together.
These apply to every purchase.
In some way or another, you have to have all six elements to get to the end of an acquisition. And as we've talked about, with a micro purchase, if you're buying something with a credit card off the web, you go through these very quickly. And if you're buying something complex, like a major weapon system, it could take years to do the same thing. But if you're missing any one of them, you never get to the contract award and you never get your government mission accomplished. Let's go through them one by one again. If you don't have a solution, if you don't have a requirement, or if you have a poor requirement, what happens?
Nobody bids, or nobody understands what they're going to bid or understands what you want.
Yeah, you never really get off the ground. If you do manage to throw together an acquisition and industry doesn't understand the requirement, you may not be able to award because nobody actually gave you something awardable, or you may award a contract that doesn't meet the requirement because nobody really understood it and your mission suffers.
And that's why this is the base. And we've talked at length in other episodes. This is hard. This is not, writing a requirement is not an easy thing to do, but it's critically important because it's the base of the cube.
What happens without a schedule? You have to be able to clearly state when you need whatever the solution is, when you need this supply or service.
Without a schedule, you can't prioritize, you can't plan. The industry doesn't know when you want this. Is this something that they should be preparing for an RFP to drop tomorrow? Or is it something that it's a nice to have idea 2 years from now? And then how fast will the contract be delivered? When are you going to need it? Such a critical piece to help understand how the cube is held together. When are you going to need this to be done?
It's hard to get to the other sides of the cube without knowing the when. Next is the where, the location. Where are we doing this work? Where are we delivering this work? I can't tell you whether I can do it on your schedule until I know where the job is or where the delivery is.
And will it be by Zoom or do I have to be in the building? That little example of where am I going to be? We did an episode about where are you, meaning where's the location of delivery? And if this is a product, are you delivering it to St. Petersburg, Florida, where I live, or St. Petersburg, Russia? There's a slight difference behind the comma there, but that makes a big difference.
It's a little harder one versus the other. Got to make that clear up front. The next side is the provider or the contractor. Who is going to do the work? Has anyone ever done this kind of work before? Do they have to figure out how to do it from scratch? Is it done in the commercial world, or is this really a government-only kind of thing?
We want a list of good companies to pick from, one of which will end up being on that side of the cube, but you have to be thinking about that early, and you have to have somebody to deliver the contract. So there's got to be a who. There needs to be an expectation of who they will be as early as possible. Otherwise, you end up with a five-sided cube.
Yeah, and the schedule and the location have an impact on how many providers, on which providers are available to you.
Like I did with my roof. I had the what, the when, and where was at my house, right? But I hadn't thought through who the providers would be until the last. And so as a result, I got who was available, not necessarily who was the best provider. I mean, it worked out okay, but I really should have been thinking about who could do this when I was coming up with the other elements. And I kind of ended up with a five-sided cube.
That gets you to the last side, the price. Without knowing how much it might cost to provide this solution on this schedule in this location and what kind of providers can do it, you can't budget for it. You don't know if you can afford the job.
This is such a great example of why communication is important, because if the government's etched in $500,000 on that side of the cube, but in industry, this is a $4 million project, the size of that side of the cube is going to grow and throw the whole cube off. So it's really important that the government folks understand what is a reasonable price to expect to pay for this, because it greatly impacts the overall shape of the cube.
So now we got the base, we've got four sides. What do we need? We need the roof. We need the topper for it, the acquisition strategy. This is where you bring all of the other elements together and figure out how are we actually going to buy this. If your acquisition strategy doesn't take the base and all four sides into account, you're going to have a very complicated acquisition. It's going to take longer to award. It's going to be, you might never award, or worse, you might pick the wrong company.
The roof has to fit. So the acquisition strategy has to fit. Like you said, considering the four squares and the base, it needs to be roughly the same size as the base. It needs to fit around those four sides. Otherwise, it's going to fall through. Again, now you have a bucket, like you mentioned before, or it's too big and it's like this overhanging roof that you then have to figure out how to make it work. And then it's not a cube. So it's really important to understand. You can't decide before you have a requirement, before you have funding, before you have a schedule. Hey, we'll just put this on the GSA schedule. Look at what you're doing first before you make that decision. That's why this is the roof. You have to consider all those other factors. And I'm raising my hand because I didn't develop the cube idea until recently. But when I was a contracting officer, I'm looking back, I'm like, oh, because we decided on the acquisition strategy before we had the other four sides and the base all figured out. That's why it was such a frustrating contract.
Yeah. You can't decide to make it a small business set aside before you've figured out whether or not there are any providers, small businesses, that can do this job on this schedule in this location that you need within your budget. If you do, you might release a solicitation and get no bids and get to start over again. A solid acquisition strategy is the key to a successful acquisition, and that's why we spend so much time at Skyway working on the thought of how could the government buy? What are the different options to pull all these elements together and put a roof on the cube? How would a commercial company buy this?
I was on a podcast yesterday as a guest, and they were asking me, what's the creative part of government contracting? Is it all just process? And I answer that question here with the acquisition strategy. It's probably the most creative part of government contracting because there's 100 ways to do it. In our analogy here, it has to fit. The roof has to fit, and there's lots of ways to make it fit. But you got to figure out what's the right fit for what you're actually doing.
Yeah, I think that's how guys like us made our way in the government contracting world, was the creativity required to put together an acquisition strategy to buy something complicated. It's not just pull out the checklist from the last time.
It's the thinking part of the job.
Let's pause here for a moment and link this to the acquisition and execution time zones.
And if you're not familiar with those, they're in episode number 3 and episode 84.
The GovCon acquisition cube resides on the acquisition side pre-award. And it touches on all of the zones, right? The base is the requirement zone. The market research zone is where you're assessing all of the others and building that acquisition strategy. The RFP zone is where the solicitation is released and industry is responding to your acquisition strategy. And the selection zone is where the government is picking a winner, choosing who they're going to buy this from. It kind of trickles past that award date into the execution time zones because, Kevin, in the honeymoon zone,
you see if you did it right. You see if the cube actually had 6 equal sides.
Yeah, this is your first opportunity to understand whether or not you made the right decision in selecting your contractor. All right, let's focus on the government, folks. Why does the government care about getting all 6 sides of the cube right?
Because knowing all 6 elements enables contract award. When you line them up as early as possible and you can tell which one is missing and which one is off kilter, like the acquisition strategy we have and the requirement we have and the schedule we have doesn't match the price. The best way to figure that out is to ask industry, to get there, is communicate and see if it's a realistic price, realistic schedule. All of those elements have to fit together. And the more we realize that, the more effective the contract will be.
Industry will tell you if you've got one of the sides off. If you're expecting far more than can be delivered in that time or for that price, they'll tell you. Remember, the purpose of the contract is to deliver something, a product or service, to support your mission. A contract is not just for the sake of a contract. It's for the mission in the end. Industry folks, of course, care about the contract being awarded. They care about the cube closing on all sides only if they get to win, right? Maybe holistically, maybe big picture, they care about the mission overall, but what they really care about is winning the work. And if any of the sides are off, they may not understand how to win. Industry folks, you can shape every one of the sides. You can shape that base, the requirement, the solution. You can help the government understand how you do this, what your product is, and maybe those requirements end up sounding a lot like what you do.
Or industry can shape, this is work that can be done remotely. If you do the work remotely, that's a huge difference in what the overall acquisition strategy, the roof, is going to be. So it's important as a contractor to understand industry can shape all 6 sides of the cube if, and it's a big if, you start early, number one, and you target. If you're doing both of those things, you'll clearly understand, hey, that's an unreasonable price. Nobody can deliver for that. Here's why. I need to communicate that. But if you communicate that during the RFP zone, it's too late. So you got to be on time and you also have to be targeting. But think about the ability of industry to shape all 6 sides of the cube. And government, you should be okay with that because it's going to make the cube more effective and make the contract more effective.
And if either side has miscommunicated or sized one side of the cube wrong, then it's not a cube. It's some other jacked up geometric shape or a bucket, I guess, is what, without the acquisition strategy. The elements are equally important. And if you haven't covered the first 5, you can't get to that acquisition strategy, the roof that brings it all together and allows you to award a contract and meet your mission, or allows you to win a contract and help the government be the one that delivers the mission, enables the mission for the government.
To revisit all 6 to refresh before we go out: solution, schedule, location, provider, price, and acquisition strategy. That's the order to look at them. You've got a base and 4 sides and a roof. And we have to communicate about all 6 sides. Or I like your jacked up geometric shape. It's the best visual to give, is that if all the sides aren't equal and they aren't effectively understood, the contract just won't materialize correctly or effectively.
All right, Kevin, I think that's it for today. We're taking one of these complicated, only in Kevin's brain kind of concepts and trying to explain it without any visuals on a podcast. I hope we did this well. Send us a note or give us a call if we left something out. All right, Kevin, I'll talk to you later.
All right, I'll see you, Paul.
Okay, that's it for the GovCon Acquisition Cube. When you need help interpreting how the sides of the cube fit together and are ready to build your relationship with Skyway's team of former contracting officers, go to skywayacq.com or give us a call at 877-884-5280. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.